So maybe we start. So the first speaker today is Professor Fariba Karimi from Graz University of Technology, and also from Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, in Austria. And the title is Inequalities in Complex Networks. If you allow me to say just a few words concerning Professor Fariba Karimi herself. She is a group leader in the computational social science team at the Complexity Science Hub and professor of social data science at Graz University of Technology. Fariba received a PhD in physics and computational science from Umeå University in Sweden. And she has very good account of works of the results, and recently in 2023 she received the Young Scientist Award from the German Physical Society for her research on inequalities in complex networks. So this is exactly the title of her topic today. So please, Professor Karimi, you start.
So thank you very much for your introduction and for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure, I have to say, to be here. Let me, okay, do you see my presentations in the full mode? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, now it's very good quality.
Okay. Perfect. So yeah, thanks for being here. So I would like to, if the chair allows, I would like to make this presentation more interactive, meaning that whenever you have questions, you have comments, please ask me during my talk, and do not wait. You don't have to wait for so long, and that I can take the questions as we move on. Is that okay for the chair?
Yes. Yes, it's
I believe yes, of course.
Okay, perfect. So please help me make this as most clear and informative as possible. So it's a great pleasure to be here. So let me start by saying that we live in a difficult time, that inequalities are rising. We have gender and racial and ethnicity inequalities. We have immigration crisis, refugee crisis, some of those related to this war and conflict that we are facing in. We have algorithmic biases such as social fragmentation, polarization, echo chambers, and so on. And I really believe that complexity science is giving us important tools in this difficult time to basically understand these multifaceted inequalities and tools to mitigate their effects. And I hope we can learn something from this together. So let me give you a kind of an overview of type of research that I have been doing the past couple of years with my great team. So people belong to various social identities, right? Social identities, it could be gender, it could be immigration, it could be ethnicity and other factors. And these social identities are important because it affects how we identify as groups and how we interact with each other. So these interactions then in the macro level create this emergence of structures of social networks that are non-random and are important to understand. Why? Because a structural condition then determines the dynamical processes that unfold on them. For example, how information is spread, how cultures and norms basically formed, or even how diseases are spread in society and how we perceive others in society. So structure is important. But nowadays, this structural information and also biases that exist in this structure are triggering to algorithms, to, for example, link recommendation algorithms, those that we use in daily life that rank people, rank item, or give us recommendation of whom to connect to or which paper to read. So what happens is that through these inequalities are being reinforced and creating compounding and second order effects through algorithms that is usually difficult to understand and comprehend. And what is even worse is that the algorithms also reshape our social networks in various ways that I will explain later. So basically, we are dealing with a dynamic, path-dependent, time-dependent system. And I would like to understand this kind of ecosystem from a complex adaptive systems perspective. So let's start with some definitions that I think are useful to move the talk forward. Because I cannot see a raised hand, it would be nice if you can verbally signal or put something in the chat that notify me that I need to react. So what do I mean by minority in my work? I use the word minority a lot, and by that, mathematically speaking, I'm talking about numeric minorities, a group in society that are smaller in size compared to other groups. So for example, one example is women in physics, for example, in physics and science and engineering in general that are minorities, they are numeric minorities, somewhere in between 10% to 20%. And there has been also a lot of research of ours and others trying to understand why participation of women is so small and how we can basically remove this gender gap in academic participation. Now, with this, in the context of mathematical models, minorities can be other entities too. So I think it's useful to think about it from your perspective, where you think that that context is more important. Now, we also know that in many contexts, minorities are actually become marginalized or disadvantaged in society. So for example, if you look at managerial jobs in the United States, you see a huge differences between white and Black and Hispanic people in terms of what kind of jobs they get. And this is important because these create a structure in which inequalities can grow and become exacerbate for certain groups. So I want to understand this type of a structure, what we call as structural inequalities. Basically, the idea that people belong to multiple interconnected social categories embedded in an interconnected system of power and privilege, and these two together work together to create a structure that can result in inequalities. And moreover, it can be exacerbated by AI systems and algorithms these days. And more specifically, I'm interested in structural marginality. What happens that certain group of people become margin of the society, margin of social networks, go to the periphery of social network. Okay, so when we talk about this, usually people might ask, so networking is good. We know that people need to network and this is important, but the point is that not everyone has the same advantages. I think we have talked a lot about cumulative advantages in the literature about networks, but we haven't talked about cumulative disadvantages that is the opposite side of networking. Now imagine Ising. Imagine you are working on a related model of Ising and others, and if you are in Europe, you have an easier chance of meeting Ising, let's say in the 1980s or 90s, finding a common friend to give you introductions in order to discuss your ideas with him. But if you would be somebody sitting in South America, this would be almost impossible in that time. So what is important to understand is that these networks act as social capitals can also marginalize certain groups. Now, you also might ask, okay, so why, I mean, if these people are a small group of people, why should we care? This is just a numerically small group, so who cares? The point is that people who are marginalized in society, not only they have problems in terms of access to education, healthcare, and business outcomes. But also, as we live in a complex, interconnected world, all of us will suffer from these consequences in one way or another. And this can create a generational inequalities that I think is very important and difficult to eradicate. So generation to generation, these disadvantages accumulate and eventually we all suffer from it. Okay, so in my research, I try to approach this through mathematical models, simulation models, and network science. And I want to, in this talk, focus on a couple of forces that I have been studying in together with my collaborators and my team. One type of forces are social forces, for example, group identity, in-group favoritism. Other types of forces might be really like a space and time constraints, right? The place we are, the time we have. Some forces might be algorithmic forces. For example, how people are ranked in systems, how do we perceive others in Twitter or various online social media platforms. And some forces are historical forces. So we have certain groups in the population that historically were disadvantaged, and that those disadvantages might carry their footprint in the structure to the present time, even though they are not historically kind of disadvantaged anymore. So, of course, addressing all of this is very complex, but I try to do this in a simple way and one step at a time. So the first thing I want to tell you about is about these social forces, right? And I focus mainly on two mechanisms that has been studied a lot in the literature, and one is homophily and preferential attachment. Homophily basically is in-group favoritism, the fact that we like to connect to people who are similar to us. Now you see homophily everywhere. You see homophily in friendship at high school. You see homophily in terms of blogosphere, political blogosphere. And what is interesting is that this simple human condition of being attracted to similar others in the macro level create this emergence of basically segregated communities in social networks. The other aspect, social force I told you is basically preferential attachment or rich gets richer effect. This is something that you are familiar with. So the question was that we wanted to understand how minorities are being visible in social networks through this simple mechanism of homophily. So basically the way we do it is very simple. We define a homophily parameter, a range of one single parameter that ranges from 0 to 1. And we have two groups of population, a binary group of orange and blue, and orange numerically are smaller than the blue. And we want to see what happens in the macro level in a social network when we have when we tune this homophily parameter from 0 to 1. So now we can generate variety of scenarios, of social network scenarios. Here I'm showing you 3 cases. You can have a heterophilic network, meaning that when value of homophily is below 0.5, you have conditions where orange likes to attract to blue and blue likes to attract to orange. When you have 0.5, you have the neutral case where people basically with the same probability like any color, so they become basically colorblind or color independent. And for values from 0.5 to 1, you basically have homophily, meaning that the probability of connecting to the same color increases up to the extreme. So what happens now when we generate these social worlds and we look at the degree distribution of the minority and majority in these two worlds? What we see here is that minorities in the homophilic regime, where they like to interact with similar others, the degree distribution basically fall behind the degree distribution of the majority. And what it means is that you will have less likely to find high degree nodes of the minority group compared to the high degree nodes of the majority group. And the opposite is true for the heterophilic case, where minorities attract all the majorities. So they have less competition among themselves because they are smaller in numbers. So they have higher likelihood to have higher degrees compared to the majority nodes. So what happens if now we can investigate in more detail basically the exponent of the degree distribution. Here I'm showing the exponent of the minority degree distribution as a function of their size. So what you see here is that, first of all, the exponents that are around -3 is basically recovering the original model of Barabashi-Albert, meaning that basically it follows the exponent tree that we expect. But as exponents goes down, become smaller, basically minorities suffer more and more from stretching their degrees to high values. And what is also interesting here is that you see this nonlinear effect with the group size. So as minorities become smaller in size, right, as become 10%, the disadvantages become more and more severe. Another interesting point is that this basically there is this tipping point here, the minimum here, where minorities disadvantaged most in this intermediate range of homophily, where not only they are not being attracted by the majority, but also other minorities prefer majorities. And then what happens after this point is that when homophily really gets stronger, it takes over preferential attachment. Now minorities can at least attract other minorities, and then they can recover the degree exponent. Okay, so this is about the degree exponent, but what happens to the ranking dynamic? And ranking is important because anything we do in life in terms of ranking people or ranking web pages and so on, we are using basically more or less degree centrality or page rank centrality of the nodes in the network to rank importance. So this means top 10% in the rank, top 20%, top 30% based on the network centrality of the nodes. Now, all else equal, if minorities are 20% of the population, our expectation is that minorities need to appear in each rank 20% of the time. But what you see here is that in the homophilic networks, minorities do not appear in the ranks compared to what we expect from their size, suggesting that something such as their social capital or visibility are being compromised because of the way they interact with others. So the homophily basically doesn't help minorities here to increase basically their representation. Okay, if there is something that needs to be clarified, please ask questions. So far, I mentioned that in these scenarios, these are hypothetical, of course, scenarios. We assume all else equal. What it means is that there is nothing else about these nodes that differentiate them except this color, right? In reality, this all else equal can be contested, right? So let's think of scenarios like this. We can have scenarios, and we have a lot of scenarios in real life that there is inequality of opportunities in the first place. What it means is that two groups might not have systematically the same opportunities to grow their social network with the same force. So let's assume this example of Black and white scholars, scientists. So a recent study showed that Black scientists get less funding compared to white scientists. This is a US-based study. I'm curious to know what kind of dimensions in Europe affects who gets the funding. But if that is the case, so think about the consequences. If a group doesn't get enough funding, that means that you cannot hire people. That means that you cannot grow your basically scientific ideas and your basically academic capital, so to say. So in this scenario, you have one group that have less equality of opportunities to grow its social capital or social network compared to the other group. How can we understand this? What does that mean in our social network? So to do so, we considered a scenario like this. You have two groups of population, similar as before, but in this case, they have also intrinsic attractiveness or fitness or equality of opportunity that is modeled as a shifted Gaussian, that one group has higher kind of average fitness compared to the other group. So what happens to their social network? So until now, what we saw in the previous one is that when all else equal, minorities benefit from heterophilic interactions, and they can grow their social network, and they can have higher degree distribution compared to the majority. Now, when we have this inequality of opportunities, when we have this shifted Gaussian in this scenario, now minorities in all conditions, their degree distribution fall behind the degree distribution of the majority. And this is basically tells us that there is a limit in which we can basically do networking and we can grow our social capital. And the limit is that you need to have resources. And when the resources are scarce, you don't need networking, you need resources. And this is very important kind of message here. Okay. Okay, so this was about social forces. Is there any questions? Anything that I need to clarify? Given that I don't...
If possible, I have a short question.
Yes?
Yes. So when you spoke about referential attachment, which gives no degree distribution exponent 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you told we introduced different fractions plus homophily. And what I would interpret that this universal exponent 3 is not universal anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It depends first on fraction and second on homophily.
Yeah.
Would you expect either homophily or fraction this dependence to be less and less pronounced when you consider larger and larger networks?
Mm-hmm. You mean just purely the size of the network and not the size of the
Yeah,
network?
I say I have infinite network and really infinite. And then I would expect that, for example, for all fractions, you have the same exponent. That's something I have in physics when I say effective behavior for smaller systems and asymptotic behavior for larger systems.
Okay, I see. The simulations we did was on networks with I believe 5,000 nodes to 10,000 nodes, and we saw this effect consistently. And the exponent I showed you was also analytically calculated. I calculated analytically.
So these were exact results for the exponent.
Yeah, it was
Okay.
exactly. Another thing I have to tell you, it was really difficult actually to get that analytical right, because we are proposing not simply homophily plus preferential attachment, we are proposing homophily multiply preferential attachment.
Right.
And this also makes this interplay more tricky. And we have the analytics in the paper.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, so now let's move on to the next kind of forces that I was telling you about, the space and time constraint. And I found this very interesting and really not very explored, to be honest. So think of the scenario of a face-to-face interaction that we have in a conference or in a coffee break, in a poster session, or this place now that we are interacting. So what it means is that we are, as we are sitting here and we interact with each other, that means that we are also excluding a lot of space and times that we could potentially interact with other people, right? So space and time is this properties that determines who gets to interact with whom and who gets to be excluded from whom in the interaction. So we looked at a lot of these face-to-face interaction data sets, like 6 of them, 4 from schools and 2 from conferences. One of them was actually this conference. So as you can see, people have a badge, and in the badge there was a radio frequency detector that could detect 1 meter face-to-face proxy. So we have with the high resolution, whenever 2 people are in front of each other and interacting, we can then know at what time who is interacting with whom. And then we looked at basically degree distribution of women versus men in face-to-face gathering in these 6 cases. And what we observe is that basically sometimes the average degree of women and men are really different. And that was not something that the original model of face-to-face interaction could explain. So we re-examined the original model, which is maybe you are familiar with. It's called it's by Starnini and his collaborators. And basically, the original model suggests that you are basically dealing with a bunch of particles in a confound space, and based on physical proximity and attractiveness, intrinsic attractiveness of people, there become a probability of interacting with them or not. So we revisited this model and we asked ourselves, what if this probability of connections is not only based on attractiveness of individuals, but also it is a matter of color. So we refined the model by suggesting that the attractiveness should be multiplied to the homophily, this bilateral attractivity between nodes based on their color. So this turned out to be explaining our observation on these 6 different social networks much better than the original model. So basically, now we moved on to also explain, okay, what happens in various basically hypothetical scenarios. And basically, the idea is the same, even if the degree distribution doesn't have that kind of a heavy tail, but still what you see here is that if you have a homophilic networks, majority's average degree exceeds minority's average degree. And when you have a heterophilic networks, minority's average degree can exceed majority's average degree. And with this model, then you can go back and calculate what would be the homophily between men and women in various conferences and schools. Okay, so I think actually the most interesting potential of understanding the space and importance of space in interaction are actually studying of cities. And I don't want to go to too much details of this, but this is a recent study we did that we looked at multiple cities in the United States. We had census data of the basic composition of various racial groups in the cities. And we had also data on implicit association tests. Implicit association tests basically ask people, how do you basically ask people a couple of rapid questions, and it tries to kind of capture our implicit biases. And I don't know if you have done it. You can actually go to their website and do this test. It's very interesting. So it put, for example, association here, black, white, bad, good. And because it's a rapid test, it kind of touches on unconsciousness. So even if you want to be very careful, unconsciously, you might just really basically reveal your implicit assumptions by doing this test. So so we looked at multiple cities in the United States and looked at the association correlation between these implicit biases and racial composition. And what we found is that more larger and less segregated and more diverse cities have lower implicit bias levels and even better economic outcomes, which suggests that basically diversity and less segregation is good for not only removing biases, but also even we gain something from it. Another thing we understood from doing this exercise was that actually homophily itself was not enough to explain the model very well. we also needed what we call as heterophobia or between group homophily parameters. So the best model we could find that explains the racial composition in the city was actually the combination of looking at homophily, but also heterophobia, which means that sometimes it is not that we want to interact with people who are similar to us, but we want to avoid people who are different from us. And this repulsion and attraction together join forces in kind of shaping our social networks. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so I think now moving forward, the third force that I want to talk about was these algorithms that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you think about algorithms, I don't have to convince you that it's affecting our life and it's affecting how we perceive basically society. In Google Scholar, this kind of directed relationships are being used in Twitter or X. I have to update my slides. In web hyperlinks, basically everywhere. So we try to basically enhance our previous model to make it actually a directed graph, because a lot of these applications on the web are based on directionality of the links. So that directionality is of course important because it affects the page rank centrality or eigenvector centrality when you have directionality. But what is also interesting is that now we can examine asymmetrical behavior. What it means is that you have minority and majority nodes. You can have scenarios where homophily among the majority is low and homophily among the minority is high. So what it means, I hope you see my cursor when I show something on the screen.
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. So in this scenario, for example, both minority and majority like to interact with minority. And you can also have scenarios like this, where majority likes to attract to majority, and minority also like to attract to majority. So you see homophily is high for majority and low for minority. So here, this is nice because now we can play with asymmetries in kind of in interaction and see what kind of effects it has on the network centrality. In social networks that everybody like to connect to. They are numeric, they are small in size, but they're actually very influential. But this scenario is the opposite. In this scenario is the fact that you have a and we looked at two important link recommendation algorithms. One is a page rank, basically how individuals are ranked or how your papers are ranked in Google Scholar. And one is whom to follow. It's a people recommender algorithm. It tells you whom you need to connect to, or in Google, it might tell you which papers you need to read. So what we found is that these asymmetries in connections have non-trivial effects on the inequalities, and it can make the situation worse for the minority, especially in those conditions that both minority and majority like to interact with majority. But I think what is even more important when it comes to algorithms is the feedback, because the way we interact with algorithms is not a one-shot game. It's not that once we interact and it's over. The algorithms affect our social connections. So if node I gets this recommendation, the recommendation rank individuals and gives visibility to certain individuals. Based on that, this person decides to connect to node J in the next time step. So what is happening is that through this feedback loop over and over, not only minorities' visibility might get worse, but also our social networks are being reformed and reshaped all the time. So this long-term effects is actually very important to study with these computational models. So in a recent work that we are doing, we are looking at this feedback loop, and also we look at how long in the rank we should go to reach minorities. So if we have a minority of 30%, how much in the rank I have to go to reach minorities? So in the beginning, in the first iteration, you have to go to the 56% of the rank to see minorities when the networks are intermediately homophilic. But as you see, what you see is that as feedback continues, you have to go lower in the rank to find minorities more and more. All else equal, meaning that we are not changing the behavior of people. It's just that this loop going on and on and on. So what it means is that we are basically, minorities become less visible, right? And then our social networks are being less, becoming more and more reshaped. And I think this is important, especially when it comes to things we are experiencing now with regards to polarization and biases. So for example, if you think about this network, if you ask this person to estimate the size of the minority group, if this person is a pink person, he might say that minorities are majorities, because the only thing he sees in his ego network is other pink nodes, while pinks are the minorities. And if you ask the green node, he might have a different idea, because he doesn't see so much of pink nodes in his ego network. So the perception of us towards others can be affected by this phenomenon. So here we have the homophily that ranges from 0 to 1 as before, and we have the perception bias. Perception bias is basically what each node would estimate based on the minority, what would be the percentage of minority divided by the actual percentage of the minority. So when we have the dashed line, which this means no bias. So estimation of no individuals was correct as the same as estimation of the size of the whole group. So in this scenario, for the majorities would basically overestimate the size of the minority nodes in this scenario, in the heterophilic scenarios, where they are interacting with some minorities. And if majorities do not interact with minorities, they underestimate the size of the minority node. What is also interesting is that if we would run the Groot average, the Groot average model is basically suggests that you estimate your own perception, but also you ask your friends to estimate their perception, and then you average your own estimate with the estimate of your friends. We wanted to know whether this averaging the estimates actually improve the estimation of majorities about the minorities. What is interesting here is that if you do this exercise, you actually get better results in the heterophilic networks. If majorities have some minorities in their network, they're averaging their estimate and estimate of their friends actually help them to have better estimates. However, if they live in a homophilic networks, this doesn't help people to improve their estimation. And I would argue that this might be a reason why nowadays we are struggling with this phenomena of echo chamber and filter bubble, where people's belief can be distorted, partly because their friends think similarly as they are. So they basically they conform to each other's ideas, and that results in people going to their own filter bubble, right? Okay. Any questions so far?
just a small question to your last sentence. You say their friends think as ego, as they do. But that dynamic, that's the reason they are their friends, right? So in this sense, I think that that the model should by itself be dynamic, because I mean, I influence my friends and my friends influence me, right?
True. Yeah. We are not tackling that type of dynamical process. There is a big discussion of what drives what, right? Is homophily drives the behavior, or is the behavior drives the homophily? Yes.
Right. The typical feature of complex system. What was the first, the chicken or the egg, right? And then interaction define macro state, and macro state defines interaction afterwards. That's for me. That's for me. It's one more example of this phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I also ask, so what kind of dynamics do you consider here? Is it, do you solve some evolution equations, or it's discrete time and you have a kind of Markov chains or whatever?
We don't have that type of dynamic. So what we do is very simple. We build this kind of network as based on the model I explained to you earlier. And then we simply go and calculate the estimation of each node in the network, a static estimate. And then we basically average it for the majority group, the green, and the minority group. What we did.
As far as I remember, at the beginning, you showed us a newcomer, which is going to connect the network. And this newcomer means that we have something old, something new. So we have error of time. So there should be some kind of dynamics behind it. Or these are kind of stationary states or whatever. Please explain.
Yeah, so we use a growing model to model the networks, but we are not using that information for calculate. So we let the network first establish and grow and become a static network, and then we calculate this perception bias for each node in the network. But it would actually be interesting to think of scenarios where you have a dynamical growing system, and then you have the perception as you're growing the network itself, and then I think you would see very interesting results. Yeah, we haven't thought about it.
So does it mean that your results describe a kind of stationary states?
Right. I think in this way, yes, it describes stationary states, right?
And maybe at the end, it would be nice to see some more detailed bibliography, because I would like to read something on the mathematical models you use.
Yeah, certainly. I can share that with you. Yes, and get
okay,
your.
thank you very much.
Yeah. So in this work, I think the most interesting part was basically validating some of these results by actually doing cross-cultural survey analysis. I think that was also one of the major contribution of this work. It's that it's not just theoretical. We actually went out and asked 3 populations in Germany, in the US, and in South Korea. And we asked them to say, are you a minority? I mean, the minority had various categories. It could be smokers or non-smokers. Are you a smoker? What fraction of your friends are smokers? And estimate the size of the smoker in your country. And then we did this exercise for 10 various questions among, I think, 100, 200 participants, representative sample in these 3 countries. So what we see is that then really our theoretical simulation results fits very well with what we found in this survey analysis, that really people's estimate really depends on their ego network. So this is basically just a starting point of then one could take this further and look at the dynamical processes would be interesting. Okay, so now one of the other forces that I mentioned earlier was these historical effects that affects the structure. Now, I want to draw this idea from some analysis that we have done looking at gender disparities in physics. So coming from a physics background and as a woman and immigrant, I wanted to know really, I mean, the recent literature suggests that women are not getting cited and are not getting the same attention as men in science and engineering. And I wanted to know, is it some conscious biases towards citing women, or is it something more fundamental, structural happening that women don't get those academic recognition? So what we did here is that, first of all, we look at the whole citation network of American Physical Society over the course of 100 years. So this is the complete full data of American Physical Society, APS. And we mapped all the citation between papers. And what we do here is that we infer the gender of the first author. And we call this female-led papers or male-led papers, depending on who led that paper, who was the first author. You can do this exercise with the last author, and results remain more or less the same. So if you are looking at female-led papers, what we see is overall, in fact, their degree centrality or page rank centrality in the overall citation graph is smaller than what we expect from their size. So in our database, in the original version was 8% women, and you see that they are not in the top ranked centrality measures compared to what we expect. So what's going on here? Is there something related to not citing women, or is it more fundamental? So what we found is that I wish I had the slides here. So what we found is that we basically we use this mathematical tool, hypergeometric testing, which what it does is that it kind of looks at the statistical twins, two papers. It allows us to pick two papers that are very similar in the pattern of citation. And then we call them statistical twins, one written by a female-led paper and one written by a male-led paper. And then we look at the future. We look at their future citation. If we see differences between the future citations for female twin compared to the male twin, that would suggest that there is a systematic bias towards not citing one twin than the other twin. So what we found is that there is, in fact, not so much differences. There is a slight difference, but it's not big enough to explain this disparity. However, what we find is basically this devastating figure that women just arrive less and slower rate to physics compared to men. So this is number of aggregate level of number of authors that are men versus women. So what is happening is basically that you have the first mover advantage in physics, and plausibly combined with this especially historical barriers to entry for women, results in this kind of a generational structural effects that their arrival is slowed down and it's with delay. And then we have these other sociological kind of forces such as role models and other types of inequalities that kick in together and results in this structural kind of effects in the larger scale. So if you see here for individuals who are in the career age of 20 or 30, you have for 8 men, you have 1 woman. or when in the career age of 30, for 10 men, you have 1 woman. And of course, this pattern is getting better nowadays, but still it has this kind of a structural footprint that carries on over the generations and affects the next generation. Another thing that is also very interesting in this context that we are now exploring with some of my collaborators is how would this delay in arrival, and perhaps that explains Yuri's question. This actually, we are now looking at the dynamical processes. We look at the actual collaboration networks of scientists over time, and then we look at how much spreading process diffuse from man to a woman or from a woman to a man. And what we see is actually, in fact, the disparity in amount of information that diffuse from men to women, and to a lesser extent from women to men, because of this temporal and delay in arrival. What it means is that basically the ideas, it seems to, and it's still a big question for us. We don't know why this happens, but it seems like the ideas that start from women would diffuse to men fast, but the ideas that are among men would not diffuse to women very quickly. And this asymmetries in the diffusion of knowledge is very important when it comes to, as I said, diffusion of knowledge, but also who gets the job, or everything that we do as a process, as a social process of science, right? Okay. Is there any questions? Could you remind me how much time do I have?
In fact, you have until you have another 25 minutes.
Okay.
But of course, you can you can use them up to you.
Okay. In total, with the Q&A, I have 25 minutes. Okay. Okay, so speaking of dynamics, another aspects of dynamics that we have started thinking of is, in fact, the fact that we experienced during the COVID-19 pandemics higher mortality rate among lower socioeconomic groups and especially racial groups. And the question was that, why is this happening? Why do we have higher mortality rate among racial groups such as Black or Hispanic groups? So to explain that, basically we devised this model of segregated communities intertwined with the susceptible, infected, recovered or removed dynamic. And what is happening is that because of the correlation between socioeconomic status and being a segregated communities and not being able to basically quarantine yourself, these two together results in higher basically mortality rate of minority groups or certain racial groups. And what we found interesting is that if the communities wouldn't be that much segregated, in fact, we wouldn't have that much infection and mortality rate overall, which also very interesting. Okay. Now I want to basically finish the talk by giving you some ideas of where we want to go next and where I would like to go next, and get your feedback about it. So I told you until now that we have networks are ways of creating opportunities for individuals, but also disadvantaging certain people. Now the question is how we can intervene, how we can use network science and complexity science to intervene these inequalities. Now we can draw some of those ideas from these simple face-to-face interaction models that I explained to you earlier. One result we find is that talent is not enough. Connectivity matters. So if you remember in this face-to-face interaction model, we had an intrinsic attractiveness parameter that ranges from 0 to 1. The way we assign the intrinsic attractiveness to the nodes in the network is basically draw from a uniform distribution, regardless of the color. So color doesn't matter. Each node get a number from this uniform distribution. So what you see here is that in a well-mixed population where minority and majority do not care about the color, whoever that has higher attractiveness get higher average degree, or what we call as social capital in social sciences, regardless of their color, right? But look at the scenario here. You have the same nodes with the same intrinsic attractiveness. Now orange nodes fall behind the blue nodes when there is a homophily, right? So this is the first message, is that it's not all about talent or this intrinsic kind of property, but really connectivity matters. Connectivity matters in our social capital. Connectivity matters in the way we go about our life. The second point is that equalities cannot only be achieved by minorities. So imagine this scenario here. You have the minority homophily that ranges from 0 to 1, and you have the majority homophily also ranges from 0 to 1, and you have the minority fraction that is 15% of the population. Red shades means that minorities' average degree fall behind the total average degree, and blue shades means that minorities' average degree takes over. So red means they're getting disadvantaged, and blue means they're getting advantaged. So if you consider this scenario here, what's happening is that regardless of minorities' strategy, if they would be very heterophilic or homophilic, doesn't matter what they do. If majority are a little bit homophilic, minorities can always be disadvantaged. And this is simply mathematical conditions in which there is a certain limit in which you can grow your degree in kind of face-to-face interaction. And this is important because when we discuss interventions, we need to also bring the whole population on the table, and it's not only about certain groups needs to change their behavior. Another types of interventions could be algorithmic intervention. What it means is that we can try to make some of these ranking algorithms, recommender systems, link algorithms a little bit more fair by, let's say, manipulating the page rank a little bit, or manipulating the network linkage a little bit. But these are, of course, all raise some questions regarding fairness that are very important and timely, and we need to ask. And finally, I want to emphasize that computational models are useful because it can give us long-term insights and policy guidelines. It can help us basically to apply models, apply scenarios and policies with more data-informed methods. So for example, think of the scenario of minorities in high network positions. We have the case of CEO meetings in Germany. You have the picture from 1900, and you have a picture from 2022, and nothing has changed. I mean, presumably, women have been very active in corporate boards and in participation of various organizations, but why are they not in the high positions in the network? So we could do this exercise with computational model. Now imagine we have a scenario that is growing. Now here again, we are talking about more from the dynamical perspective of it. We have a network that is growing. You have a 10% of minorities that are arriving to the system, and the network is growing. And now you can impose an intervention. One intervention could be group size intervention, or quota, or what we call as affirmative action policy. You suddenly say that from now on, 90% of people who come to the system should be minorities, which of course is very unrealistic, but just for the sake of discussion. Another types of intervention you could say could be behavior. You could say that from now on, minorities should be basically cohesive. We create these meetings for them to help them to basically grow their network. So we wanted to know which kind of interventions are more useful for increasing the ranking of minorities. So what we found is that you can have extreme group size interventions, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that minorities appear in the top rank compared to what we expect from them, because of this kind of a cumulative effects that's happening in the network, right? This rich gets richer effect in the dynamic. But you can have a moderate group size intervention combined with behavioral intervention, people changing their behavior in terms of bringing more diverse groups in their network. And there together, this can guarantee that minorities' visibility or minorities can be going up the ladder of the ranking. So this is a useful example of why computational models can be used to inform policies, right? So going back to my first discussion, I want to emphasize that we have great tools in our disposal to understand these multifaceted inequalities that we are dealing in society these days. And I hope it gave you some inspiration for your own work. And I'm happy to hear your thoughts. And I want to thank all my collaborators and my fabulous team who are helping me with this research. Thank you.